Well, we're here again. If you've been around these parts before, you know I have a ton of respect for Naughty Dog, and it just so happens I was born at the perfect time to be their target audience. It's like their games grew up with me. I was a kid when Crash Bandicoot was big, I was in my mid to late teens as the Uncharted trilogy came out, and I was depressed all the time when The Last of Us hit. The point is, I think this team does great work, which doesn't necessarily mean I love all of their games, but they clearly care about what they do, and even in their not so great titles, their talent is obvious. So it's interesting to me how divisive the Uncharted games are these days, considering their critical acclaim on release, and I sure ate them up at the time. Some people were never on board, but with the release of another fantastic remastering job by Bluepoint, more and more people are trying them out for the first time, and not finding them to be the classics that they claim to be. So now that this series is back in the public eye and new consoles have blessed us with twice the frames and an extra 360p, there's no better time to revisit Uncharted Drake's Fortune. Now the gloves are off here. This isn't going to be some glowing, teary-eyed retrospective where I talk about how I remember liking this game. No, we are going in there. Is the first Uncharted really the beginning of a classic series? Well, the answer begins all the way back in 2006. The PlayStation 3 didn't exactly have the best start. Much like Ric Flair, it didn't start to be truly great until it slimmed down. 2006 was especially awful for Sony. The launch lineup for the PS3 was lacking, supply issues delayed the console's launch in power regions, and perhaps the biggest hit of all came at that year's E3, which revealed the infamous $599 price point, and the fact that Grand Theft Auto 4 would not be a Sony exclusive after all. While the internet was rabble-rousing about all of that, Naughty Dog showed off a trailer for their new game, which news outlets simply referred to as Untitled, and I guess Naughty Dog thought that had a good ring to it, so ended up keeping most of it. The reveal of Uncharted was interesting, but it didn't really rock anyone's world. As you can see, this footage from the trailer was 1,000 times less impressive than what would end up in the final game, for once. And the talk about it was pretty much, hey, it kind of looks like Tomb Raider, but with a dude. That's cool, I guess. Although it did take people by surprise that after a decade of platformers, it turned out the dogs were going to stop jacking around with kids' games and make something about a real-looking dude shooting stuff. It does make sense when you consider Sony's marketing. A big part of the PlayStation 1's success was acknowledging kids who grew up playing 8 and 16-bit stuff were now teens and young adults by offering them more mature games starring human beings. It worked, and played a big part in working against the stigma that video games were just toys for children. But with limitations in early 3D graphics and game design, there was still a long way to go. One of the things the Sony fanboys claimed during the dark times was the PlayStation 3's high price point and wasteland of a game library wasn't a problem because it's packing the Cell processor. This beast was trapped in a plastic case of potential, and if those silly developers would just figure out how to wield its power, Sony would be boasting productions that would make Dead Rising look like it's on the Intellivision. And in that sense, Uncharted Drake's Fortune came out at the perfect time. It was the desperately needed exclusive that finally showed off what the console was capable of. I mean, look at this. He gets in the water, and when he comes out of the water, his clothes are still wet. Somebody get my brain a cigarette because you just blew my mind. So while Lair was failing to impress critics and Sony bosses were tearing their hair out due to Metal Gear Solid 4 being delayed, Uncharted was sucking up acclaim and became one of the surprise hits of 2007. It was an easy sell too. I mean, Naughty Dog had a good track record, and Uncharted seemed to have all the stuff people wanted. Shooting and platforming and puzzles and, well, just look at it. I know this is a remastered version of the game, but still, even the original is an absolutely gorgeous looking game. It was arguably the first game that showed off Sony's hardware while also feeling like a complete work and not an elaborate tech demo. Outside of incredible art direction, there were impressive water and lighting effects, character animation where Nate would react to his environment organically, and some of the best motion capture seen in video games at that time. This has become a lot more common now, but back then it was rare for voice actors to also perform their own motion capture, which separated Uncharted from the pack in terms of attempting to portray realistic people. Obviously a lot of what I'm talking about is dated and much less impressive now, but at the time it was exciting. People felt like they had experienced something that was a huge step up from the previous generation. Finally, a decade of Sony marketing promises were coming true. We're finally getting there. Everything looks so good and there's so much tech, and it even has real humans acting in it, like a movie. We're one step closer to the holodeck, people! What helped push Uncharted's strong first impression on people was its pacing, which is important when you're trying to capture the spirit of an adventure, and it's probably the game's strongest aspect from a design point of view. The script isn't going to win any Academy Awards, but it's an action-adventure where Nathan Drake is racing a bunch of bad guys to some treasure, so at least there's always a strong sense of where you're going and what you're doing. You're regularly in new locations, and since the art is so good, that's enough to hold your attention by itself if you're not expecting much else from the experience. Shooting is the dominant mechanic, but it's regularly broken up by puzzles, climbing, cutscenes, and set pieces, so even if you don't particularly enjoy any of the mechanics in this game, you're not ever stuck on one long enough to get sick of it. Take, for example, the jet ski segments, which I think are terrible. You can't move and shoot at the same time, so they feel completely disjointed from the rest of the game, where combining movement and action is encouraged. The design is contrived with the use of random explosive barrels and convenient balconies for the impossibly well-prepared bad guys. And the part where you're going against the current of the river, and for some reason are now expected to drive past gunfire instead of shooting back, is just annoying. In most games, these parts will be one huge irritating segment, or possibly even worse than that. In Uncharted, it's 3 very short segments, a simple one to get used to it, one with an emphasis on shooting, and one focused on getting out of dodge as fast as possible. As bad as they are, they all feel distinct from each other, they're short and therefore relatively painless, plus they serve a broader purpose of implying distance between areas, increasing the scale of the adventure you're on whilst making everything feel connected. That's just one example of how Uncharted is able to keep up the momentum even when it's not being the greatest. But having good pacing doesn't make a piece of entertainment great, it just means it's easy to digest. We need to go deeper! Unlike its much louder sequels, Drake's Fortune is pretty light on the set pieces, so outside of the cutscenes, most of the game is split into the trademark shooty, climby puzzle bits. So let's have a look at all of those, and considering this studio's history, I guess it makes the most sense to start with the platforming. With Gears of War being the more noteworthy example of the whole cover shooting thing, perhaps the most recognisable thing about Nathan Drake himself and the series in general is the streamlined climbing segments. They make up the chill moments in between all the action, the connected tissue between all the explosions that allows a smooth segue into new locations. There's very few parts of this game where climbing and shooting are combined, it's pretty much just the part on the waterfall. You could argue the combat could have been made more interesting by utilising Nate's abilities more, but I think it was a good idea to have dedicated climbing segments. They're an incredibly welcome addition to the game as they allow you to slow down and take in your surroundings. It is pretty much all that Uncharted flavour of climbing too. There's very little in the way of traditional platforming. And hey, Naughty Dog seem to have forgotten some of their own greatness from Crash. There's a couple of fixed camera angles like this 2.5D bit where you run away from a bunch of dudes after Sully gets shot, and it's kind of clunky and awkward, but at least it's not long until you bump into Elena again.
Whoa there, cowboy. That's for leaving me at the dock.
What the hell are you doing here?
Listen, I'm a good enough reporter to follow a couple of no-luck tomb robbers.
Wait, how did you follow them? They left you at a dock, in a boat. How could you track a boat on land? And even if you did, how could you have caught up to them on foot this quickly? Yeah, that's what I thought. Don't worry, we'll get back to her later. When you move the analog stick, Nate will reach towards ledges and platforms and jump when you jump, but there is a little bit of resistance from the game to make it as simple as possible. Like if you hold the stick in a direction where there's nowhere for him to jump to, he won't try to reach for it, but he'll shift his body weight a little bit to indicate he acknowledges your input, he just doesn't like it. Nate won't jump until you tell him to, but even that feels deliberately out of your hands. You're never quite sure whether he's going to do a big gaspy leap or a tiny baby hop. It's like you're on the phone to him giving him suggestions, but he's doing all the real work. This is all fine and dandy when it works. Nate has the strongest fingers in the world, so there's no threat of falling off, making these parts not particularly stressful, but stuff will break and crumble as you move along, so it's involving enough for you not to nod off during it. It's pretty relaxing when it works, but on the occasions where it doesn't work, it's more frustrating because you feel like it's not your fault because you don't have full control. Everything is governed by hitboxes. Depending on your distance from the end of a ledge, Nate will interpret a jump as either a short hop along the ledge you're on, or a dive for the next one. And since you're locked into everything, you have to be within a certain distance of what you're jumping to, or Nate just won't grab it. This is at its worst when the platforms are arranged in a way where it's not obvious what one the game wants you to go for first, and Nate just falls past the wrong one. Like, sorry, I didn't realise I was going for the forbidden ledge. But that's nitpicky stuff, you know. Outside of a few outliers of jank, it basically works okay, and they smoothed a lot of this out in the sequels. That's not getting into the actual issue with the climbing segments. Okay, so, as we've established, Uncharted is friggin' beautiful. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it was one of the best looking games ever made upon its release. However, a lot of that spectacle can get stripped away when you have to start mentally deconstructing it to try and understand the level design. Don't know what I mean? Okay, so sometimes in Uncharted you complete a shootout or something, and then you're not entirely sure where the game wants you to go next, because there's a locked door or whatever. Since it's one of the core mechanics of the game, it shouldn't take you too long to assume you're supposed to climb your way out. but where to start? At first you might start running into corners and hitting the jump button, and since there's no grabbable ledge there, Nate just starts flailing around like, yeah, which looks ridiculous. It's understandable why Naughty Dog didn't want the paths to be too obvious, since this game is extremely linear, and they wanted this island to feel like a real place you were exploring, not just a straight line level in a video game. The problem that causes is now that I'm stuck, you've got me sitting around thinking, okay, where does the level designer want me to go next? The dilemma here is psychological. There's a huge difference between knowing what you have to do and figuring out how to do it, and not knowing what you have to do so you just do whatever the only option is. How is a much more elegant question to ask than, what? So, if you see a crash U-boat and the game tells you you've got to find a way to get on top of it, you can think, how can I, Nathan Drake, hero climby man of America, use my surroundings to get on top of that boat? That's a lot more satisfying and engaging than, I, Nathan Drake, do not know what I am doing, so I shall climb these rocks since God has arranged them in ascending order of height, so he probably wants me to do that. It takes away from your investment in the story, and the satisfaction of achieving your goals. At that point, you're just racing to the end credits rather than having a meaningful experience. It's a conveyance issue. They try to nudge you along with little tricks like leading you in the right direction with birds or painting pipes a certain colour, but you can still feel lost every now and then. Take this part, where there's a locked door, and a prompt will get Nate to check his map, which has the same symbol on it as the door. That's the game's way of telling you you're supposed to go to the tower, which requires climbing up these seemingly unconnected pillars in this area, knocking one of them over in a QuickTime event and nearly dying, climbing up them again, climbing across this building and jumping into the top of the tower. Up there you'll find a skeleton that has the key, and I guess Sir Francis Drake knew that a skeleton man would die in the tower with the keys, and stay there for 400 years, so this was a logical conclusion for young Nate to make. But I only figured this out because of the contrived layout of the pillars. But I guess this is probably a good time to explain the Sir Francis Drake stuff a bit more. Okay, so Nathan Drake is a thief who claims to be a descendant of the 16th century English sea captain Sir Francis Drake, who's well known for nicking treasure from all around the world and playing a part in defeating the Spanish Armada. In Drake's fortune, we don't know for sure if Nate is telling the truth or not, especially since Sir Francis apparently never had any children, but he definitely looks up to him as an idol.
This was Francis Drake's ring. I, kind of inherited it.
Sic parvis magna?
Greatness from small beginnings. It was his motto.
Sir Francis plays a key role in the actual plot too. It's fitting that Sully survived being shot in the chest due to Drake's diary, because it's basically the heart of the entire story. Nathan Drake and Sully are on the hunt for the lost treasure of El Dorado, and Sir Francis had essentially the exact same adventure in the 1590s and wrote it all down in his diary that's found at the beginning of the game. From there on, it's borderline comical how the story plays out. Nate goes from point to point the same way Sir Francis did before him, only he doesn't have to do any of the actual work or exploring because it's all written down in the book. I know a character piecing things together from different sources of information they find along the way is the structure of a lot of mystery fiction, but this is like a bad Doctor Who episode. It's like the adventure is already written out in the diary and we're just catching up to it. There's a part near the end of the game where Nate discovers the corpse of Sir Francis, and I was thinking this is going to be Nate's character arc. He's going to have to find the strength to finish this himself where his hero failed. But nope, he pieces together the final part of the mystery by watching a film left on a projector by the Nazis that the monsters were polite enough to not knock over when they were murdering everyone. It all raises a huge question mark over Nate's abilities. I mean, would he have got anywhere close to El Dorado if two military operations hadn't done all the groundwork for him? You could maybe argue this is intentional, and Nate living in the shadow of his claimed ancestor is some kind of attempt to make him more flawed or interesting, but considering the amount of scenes dedicated to establishing that both Nate and Sully are highly experienced in this sort of work, and the fact that every time Nate finds new information from Sir Francis, it's an excuse to go to a new location, my personal vote is that it's just bad writing. I want to congratulate myself on getting this far into a critique of Uncharted without bringing this up, because you kind of have to eventually. So yeah, this whole diary thing is kind of a rip-off of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Both are used by a character to solve puzzles they otherwise couldn't, both add tension to the story by falling into the hands of the villains, and they're pretty similar in terms of their importance as a plot device generally. Before you get riled up, I'm not bringing this up to make awful criticisms about how Uncharted is bad because it rips stuff off. We're talking about different mediums here. You could make a video game with the exact same plot as an Indiana Jones movie, and I would love it if you were able to capture half the spirit of it, so I'm not ragging on Uncharted for ripping it off. I'm ragging on it for not ripping it off enough. Without going into too much detail, in The Last Crusade the diary serves purposes outside of containing all of the plot stuff and puzzle solutions. Here it belongs to Indy's dad, so it's used to raise the stakes immediately when it's sent to Indy, and he knows his dad wouldn't do that unless he was in major trouble. It also helps establish the relationship problems between Indy and his dad. Both are dedicated to the same line of work, but one is more into the fieldwork side while the other focuses on research, hence the huge importance of the diary in the first place. So on top of its basic use as a plot device, the diary is used to tell you something about the characters. Imagine if in Uncharted the diary had belonged to Sully, who is Nate's father figure in this series, and he was the more experienced explorer thief guy who researched the late career of Sir Francis to find his missing treasures, possibly due to how much Nate kept going on about it. Then he's shot and captured along with his notes, leaving Nate to figure some stuff out by himself for the first half of the game until he finds a way to save him. Then they team up and work together, combining one's knowledge from exploring the island with the other's research, then they solve the mystery together. Instead, it's Nate finding the Francis diary, Sully getting shot and assumed dead for a bit, Nate follows the clues on the map, then Sully isn't dead and they reunite, then they just follow the clues in the diary together. So for all the difference it makes, it could have just been three explorers meeting up for the first time ever. If I hadn't already played the other two games before, I don't think I could tell you much of substance about this relationship at all. That's the meaning of the diary to the characters. To you as the player, or participant, or whatever term you'd prefer, the diary is the thing you open up when the game tells you to because there's a puzzle. And I think it's fair to say the diary does not give you hints as much as it tells you the answer. You'll come to a structure with a bunch of symbols on it, you open the diary on a page that has some of those symbols drawn in it, and you move the thing so those symbols look like that. That's it. I get why Naughty Dog would want to make the puzzle simple. This isn't Professor Layton, this is action-adventure schlock. You don't want to derail someone's momentum by letting them get stuck on a block sliding contraption for 25 minutes. There is something to be said for the actual act of working on the solution, even if figuring it out isn't part of it. When you're adventuring into an unknown, it's still interesting to wait for that click when the solution works and something starts to happen. That's where Drake's Fortune fails the most on the puzzle aspect. Things are too small scale in this game, apart from maybe the part where you have to follow the correct Roman numerals. This is definitely another thing the sequels did better, where puzzles were a big set piece in themselves, that you worked on like they were a project, building up to something big happening. But in this game, most of the time you're just plugging in an elaborate code that's flat out handed to you, just for the spectacle of watching a door open. Well, Nathan Drake might not be good at figuring out puzzles without cheating, but I can tell you one thing he's really good at, and that's shooting lots of dudes with guns. Right, look, let's get this out of the way, just in case you're either jonesing for or dreading this. I'm not going to start going on about how cover-based shooting is boring and the devil and ruined games or whatever. Yes, it was overdone following the success of Gears of War, and there are lots of terrible knockoffs where you hide behind a rock and shoot the mans until they're all dead, but that's not due to any failure in the concept, that's just bad level design. Cover-based shooting isn't inherently better or worse than non-cover-based shooting. You might prefer one of them to another, but both acknowledge movement and space as vital aspects to shooters, they just go about them in different ways. Cover-based shooters focus on moments, that moment where you're holding out waiting for your health to regenerate, that moment where the last guy finally sticks his head out, that moment where you finally get an opening to move in close enough to take out the rocket launcher guy, and so on. If there's one major thing that holds Drake's Fortune back from being a great shooter, I think they could have done more to keep the player moving. A lot of people don't like Uncharted's combat at all, and I think that's because they often sit in one spot taking shots until they run out of ammo, which wasn't the design intention. Whereas I played these games a lot when they first came out, so I don't think twice about taking out a dude, running out of cover, softening up a different dude with blind fire, and finish him off with a punch before sliding into the next safe spot. I've beat the whole trilogy on crushing difficulty where you die almost immediately if you don't stay in cover, and I don't recommend it. It was kind of a joy to return to this game on normal and be able to stretch my legs again. And it's not like the game does nothing to get you moving. You may have noticed the over-the-shoulder camera view is at a weird angle. It's like Nate is shooting diagonally into the middle of the screen. Most of the guns aren't very precise, and the ones that are don't turn up very often. Naughty Dog wanted you to waste a whole bunch of ammo frantically spraying it at pirates, because you know, gunfights are often like that in movies, so unless you're 360 no-scope level, you're going to be needing fresh ammo, and the only way to get it in most encounters is to take it off dead bodies. If you run completely dry, you can still run to the nearest guy and punch them out, which is risky, but you can do it much faster if you hit a brutal combo. You do these by hitting square, then triangle, then square again, but hitting square does a punch, and then pressing triangle does nothing until you hit square again, which is awful feedback and like the least intuitive thing ever, so I never use it. But the point is, at the very least, the juggling of different weapons for different situations, plus ammo scrounging, is there to try to get you on your feet. I do still acknowledge the whole not moving thing as an issue. There are encounters in this game that don't really work out as planned. The first half of the game has a bunch of turret sections, like this part where it's positioned on the second floor so it has a height advantage over you. You won't last long out in the open, so your priority is to use your openings to get in close on the turret so you can throw a grenade up there. The intention is the turret controls the pace of the encounter, deciding when you can or can't move, and the tension comes from not allowing the other guys on the ground to move in on you, so you're supposed to use your small windows of being able to move to fight and push back against the enemies and claim control of the space. Or you blow the turret guy up with a rocket launcher in 2 seconds, then just have a normal shootout with everyone else. Huh. In the second half of the game, the turrets get swapped out for the laser sight guys, who will kill you in one hit if they get a clear shot on you, so you need to be in cover or constantly rolling. But although the designers might have envisioned that this would get the player to keep Fred Dursting their way into new cover, it normally means that you take these guys out immediately before the ground troops move in, or if that's not an option, you just stay in cover. And look, I get it, I understand the tension of having a long range, difficult to take out threat pin you down while a short range threat moves in on you, but too much of that, especially in a game where blind fire is really effective, runs the risk of locking the player into one spot for too long, and you might end up giving them the wrong mindset. I think rocket launcher guys and explosives are a lot more effective. After all, in a game about cover and regenerating health, there's nothing more terrifying than an enemy that can kill you in one hit, while in cover. I like how on the first rocket launcher enemy you ever encounter in the game, they bait you into his range by giving you this one guy of his back to you for free. Then boom! Explosion out of nowhere and that jarring, ear-ringing sound effect starts going off. Right away, this guy teaches you to respect him, which creates a cool moment when you take him out and steal his perch to acquire your own first rocket launcher of the game. As soon as you enter his spot, you trigger the next wave of enemies so you get a nice chance to try it out. This is good, I like this. It's another example of how good cover-based shooting starts off with you being oppressed by the space and lets you experience the empowerment of slowly gaining control over it. Uncharted does have good design like that in it. It's convenient for the game that its settings involve lost cities and ancient ruins, since that gives it plenty of excuses to build elaborate arenas of pillars, arches and debris, so the level designers can play around with geometry as much as they want while still having believable environments. I like the encounter that's basically a room full of pillars where dudes drop in from several locations. The framing of the shootout is changing constantly, so you're always having to move and reposition yourself to stay on top of what's going on. Generally, the best encounters are the larger scale ones, like the ones in the church, or this one in some hall where taking out a turret forces you into a corner, leaving you surrounded and then you have to fight your way out, only for the encounter to then be reversed as you control the cover as new guys spill into the room from where you entered. This is solid stuff, but solid is about as far as it goes. I do like the combat in this game, but it does all the basic variations of layout and mixture of enemy types and weapons, and that's about it. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just that there's not really an iconic Drake's Fortune level or set piece, especially when compared to its much louder sequels. Maybe you could argue that the part in the old Nazi submarine base where the game becomes survival horror is an interesting drift away from the combat's basic design principles, and I do like the idea of this part. It completely changes the pace from the other encounters in the game, since cover and hand-to-hand combat is suddenly torn out of the playbook. But it's not very long, and the game is way too generous with ammo for this part to have any real tension. If the ammo was really strict and you had to distance yourself away from all the monsters as much as possible to aim properly and make every hit count, it might have worked better. Instead, running around in circles firing your gun randomly like a Trump supporter gets the job done. And for some reason, headshots still work on these guys, so you can ice them in seconds. That ain't threatening. Also, the one part where you have to fight goons and monsters at the same time while they fight each other is pretty cool, but it's really short. I'm guessing this was a big headache for the programmers and the designers. But wait, why am I talking about the Monster Mash right now when I haven't even covered my favourite thing about the combat yet? I think Uncharted's health system is neat. Just on its own terms, I really like how the colour drains from the screen as you get hit. It's a strong visual indicator of how much damage you've taken without cluttering the screen with an ugly health bar or something. It's also jarring. You take one hit and your whole perspective of the world changes, and this game's beautiful environment adds to the relief you feel when all the colour flows back and everything returns to normal. Some people like to ridicule these kinds of health systems, like, what, he gets shot like 6 times and hides behind a wall until all the bullets fall out. That don't make no sense. These people probably can't get their head around anything turn-based either. Alright, look, there's this thing called abstraction, and there's another thing called a metaphor. Is it really so difficult to get your head around the idea that these people hide behind cover so they don't get shot, rather than to suck healing juice out of the limestone? It makes 1,000 times more sense if you read it as Nate coming closer to death because he's putting himself at more risk as he leaves himself more exposed. I mean, it's either that or you accept that Nathan Drake is some forgotten member of the X-Men with a healing factor and gets shot 5,000 times across the course of a day. Everyone else gets shot a couple of times and they're dead. You may counter by bringing up that the bullets are clearly hitting Nate as he takes damage, but it's a video game! Imagine how frustrating and confusing it would be if bullets started flying by you and some unclear invisible algorithm was deciding how close you were to death. It would be nonsense! Nate taking a hit is a universally understood indicator of get your head down. I like the concept of cover shooting mixed with regenerating health a lot. As far as video game abstractions go, this is one of the least silliest anyone has ever come up with. It allows you to play an action hero who can get into dozens of gunfights while highlighting how scared they are to die, and they don't lose because they took their 4,000th bullet in the chest, they lost because they made a mistake or because they got overwhelmed by the odds. So here in Uncharted, we have a game where we play as a human being, only being able to carry the amount of ammo and weaponry a real person can carry, having to make do with whatever he finds along the way, someone who is as vulnerable to being shot as anyone else and is damn sure afraid to die. Among all the schlock and nonsense in Uncharted, surely we can admit that this is a positive contribution to the ongoing sophistication of video games. And hey, maybe we could take this abstraction just one step further, like, maybe most of these gunfights aren't entirely literal, but a metaphor for Nate's ongoing struggle to navigate around the island while being outnumbered by hostile forces. You can beat most of the enemies in the game by softening them up with gunfire, then putting them down with a single punch. That wouldn't kill them, right? Maybe this is just a logical way to convert the 2-hour action movie into an 8 to 10 hour video game, and we're not actually murdering hundreds of people. Alright, there's very little room for interpretation here. Everyone dies in Uncharted. The script clearly expresses multiple times that there's a lot of guys on this island and they're all dying.
And now, my men are dying. They can't even go outside to take a piss without an armed guard! And I have nothing to show for it!
You might say that despite the fact literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of people are gunned down in this race for treasure, Nathan Drake is just a relatable everyman who's just trying to find his way on some island in the Pacific Ocean or wherever it is, and all these pirates keep attacking him and he's just retaliating. It's not like he's a violent psychopath who gets off on this or anything. Before I go any further here, I should point out I have no issue with violent video games, or violence in any media for that matter. The main problem with violence in games is not a matter of taste or offending people. The problem with video game violence is it's usually completely meaningless and carries no dramatic weight. We're at the point now where we can play as real looking people shooting other real looking people within the context of a proper narrative, but a lot of games still approach this with the same design mentality as Pac-Man eating a line of dots to get to the next stage. When you don't consider the context or meaning of your violence properly, and you have 1,000 dudes getting shot in the face, it can come off as plain old juvenile, which is fine if you're making something silly on purpose, not so fine if you're trying to tell a story about believable human beings. Okay, to make this point clear, I need to back up and talk about the adventure genre for a bit. The appeal of exploration in fiction isn't that complicated, whether you're going into space, or deep underwater, or to some islands or lost civilizations. It's exciting when you have characters wandering into the unknown. Culture is fascinating, so when you have characters in a place they don't understand and aren't totally prepared for, discovering new architecture, language, customs, religions, and so on, and you combine that with some kind of mystery or ticking clock mechanic where there's a race to some treasure or something, if you pull all that off well, then you've got a real fun adventure on your hands. This also mirrors real life in many ways. Take Easter Island, for example. It's a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean that has those creepy head statues. They're called moai, or moe. They're the things that show up in Gradius. Gradius? Aren't they the coolest? An utterly unique creation birthed from a culture that no more than a few thousand people have ever experienced at one time. Don't you just want to know everything about how they made these things and why? Well, here's an abridged version of history. In the 18th century, European explorers discovered Easter Island and then
everyone died.
I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt here and assume you're familiar with at least one aspect of history to understand that there are some uncomfortable connotations with some adventure serials. When you write a story that involves a group of white people using the ruins of an ancient civilization as a playground for their adventures while they take all the local wealth for themselves, some people of certain backgrounds might be put off when that game has a lot of this in it. In Drake's Fortune, our heroes are a collection of treasure hunters. They're established immediately as murderers and backstabbers. They're on an island looking for the treasure of El Dorado because they like money. And I guess Nate has his thing with following in the footsteps of Sir Francis Drake or whatever. The villain is this guy. He's a bad guy with lots of money. That's about as much as the game ever establishes about him. He also wants the treasure, so he hires a bunch of guys from the island of, this is what a bad guy looks like to middle-class white people, Malia, because they're cheap.
Remind me again why you employed that superstitious idiot?
You wanted someone cheap.
Well, you get what you pay for, I suppose.
So basically, we have greedy white people in a race for treasure against another greedy white person who hired a ludicrous amount of people of colour to be murdered who aren't going to see any of the treasure either way. This is where someone might try to counter with the argument, hey now, it might start as a treasure hunt, but Nate and Sully really are the good guys. I mean, if that gas gets off the island, it could be the end of the world. To which I say, Drake's Fortune has 22 chapters, and Nathan Drake has absolutely no idea that the treasure they're all chasing is dangerous and shouldn't leave the island until chapter 19, which going by my playtimes is about half an hour before the end of the game. So everything Nate does up till that point is motivated exclusively by greed. And no, I'm not accepting Sully's death as a retort either. That happens in chapter 3. Nate mentions it once to Elena immediately afterwards, and then I don't think Sully is mentioned again until he shows up alive in chapter 11, and no one seems to care that much either way. When it comes down to it, the only clear distinctive difference between these two groups is one of them is white and American, and are therefore the heroes. Which is weird because the British guy doesn't realise the danger of the treasure he's hunting for until it kills him, and in the game he only ever shoots one guy, and he survives! His henchman guy does know the danger and has secret evil plans, but we don't know that until the very, very end of the game, and the pirate guys are just here for a job. I mean, okay, they don't seem like nice people, but they're here out of circumstance more than anything else. The only people on this island committing atrocities, as far as we know, is Captain Charisma and his buddies here. In the Naughty Dog behind the scenes video, the team goes on about how they wanted to make the player constantly feel like the hero, but the scenario on this island is too poorly set up for that feeling to sink in like they wanted it to. Let's hop back to Indiana Jones quickly for a crash course in how to avoid this becoming a huge issue. 1. Indiana Jones is an archaeologist, and he goes to seek out treasures because he finds them genuinely fascinating, and wants to see things in museums for the purposes of preservation and education. I know this isn't perfect either, and there's a whole other discussion about how locking up foreign nations' artifacts in Western museums is problematic, but at least it establishes he has interests outside of shooting people in the face, and isn't a complete psychopath. Indiana Jones cares about this, whereas Nathan Drake cares about this. 2. Indiana Jones fights Nazis, and also sometimes child slavers, but mostly Nazis. You give yourself a surprising amount of creative free reign when it's Nazis. All you need for character motivation is this. Dr. Jones, we believe the Nazis are looking for the Ark of the Covenant. We need you to track it down before they do. The Ark of the Covenant? But that's just a legend. Can this clown not hear me? It doesn't matter what it is, I said the Nazis want it. Even if it doesn't actually help them take over the world, it's worth getting just to annoy them. So Indiana Jones kills a whole bunch of people too, but it's established from the very beginning that the people he's fighting against must be stopped, so going home isn't really an option. I feel like this is a big part of why a lot of people struggle to connect with this game. Not only are you on another explorer's hand-me-down adventure, but you're expected to gun down hundreds, if not thousands of people with basically little to no context for why it's justified. And when you stop to consider the political implications for this for even a second, it starts to get a bit creepy. Let's make this perfectly clear right now. I'm not accusing anyone at Naughty Dog or anyone who loves this game of being racist. That's almost never the point when someone starts talking about stuff like this. A lot of the things that get branded as ist or phobic or lamatic is cultural or institutional. It's in the assumptions we make when we see the world and the stuff that's hardwired into our brains from a young age that we don't consciously think about. Therefore, a lot of these problems are invisible, and by discussing them we make them more visible so we can start challenging them. I'm not pointing out that Drake's Fortune is a little bit racist to say that it's gross trash, it should be censored and destroyed. I'm pointing it out because by failing to justify its violence with proper context, and by emulating genre tropes without challenging or rethinking them, it's accidentally undermined the fun, character-driven adventure that it wanted to provide. Because for a lot of people from all backgrounds, outside of just being uncomfortable sometimes, a lot of what happens in this game is either eye-rolling or impossible to relate to. I'll admit this part of the video was by far the hardest to write, and I know that I've skimmed over some really important and sensitive topics. As a white guy who uses Fred Durst as a verb, I don't really feel qualified to perfect the whole racism and diversity in media thing. But I hope at least I've given some insight on how Drake's Fortune's absurd amount of murder for the sake of greed can be harmful to the overall experience. Having said that, despite all the heroes being selfish, greedy, mass-murdering psychopaths presented uncritically to us in that normal, flawed, but not really that flawed at all Hollywood sort of way, Uncharted still gets a lot of credit for its characters, and people seem to enjoy them. Why is that? Well, to answer that, we've got to go back to Naughty Dog's technical expertise. I've said this already a couple of times in this video, but I want to say it again. Even if all the work doesn't necessarily always add up to something great, the people at Naughty Dog are really good at their job. The motion capture and animation in Drake's Fortune, while obviously dated now, were outstanding for their time. It was mind-blowing to see Nathan Drake flail around and hug the walls and stumble about on landing jumps in a semi-realistic way. Look at his face. He's so scared when the baddies are shooting at him. Even if you hate this guy, your brain is still able to look at him and detect humanity. A lot of this stuff is commonplace in mainstream games today, so for context, look at Fahrenheit, another high-budget motion capture acted game that came out only 2 years before Drake's Fortune. Being from an earlier generation, even this was amazing to people when it first came out, and look how weird it looks now. Everyone struts around awkwardly like they've indie gone poopersy in their pants. It's easy to be impressed by this when you're coming directly from this. The strongest aspect of the motion capture in Drake's Fortune was the fact the voice actors were doing their own body capture in cutscenes, which allowed them to give human-like performances, rather than performing a voiceover over some stumpy mannequin man. I know that Nolan North has kind of become a punchline by getting cast as every generic white guy ever since Uncharted, but it's easy to see why his career took off after Drake's Fortune. He does a really good job of squeezing some likability out of Mr. T-shirt and jeans here. If you watched a supercut of all the Uncharted cutscenes, you probably would at least not hate this guy. I feel like a lot of people aren't going to care about any praise directed at the cinematics of Drake's Fortune. As games have got bigger and more obsessed with Hollywood blockbusters, there's been a big pushback against cutscenes over the last decade. Some people consider them inherent failures of game design or something. I suppose the argument is, video games are an interactive medium, therefore anything non-interactive is not using the form to its greatest potential. Okay, first of all, yes, video games are an interactive medium, but they're also a visual one. That's what the video bit means. So if you want something communicated in a specific, non-interactive way, then you have the tools to do that. But let's just ignore that for the sake of argument. If video games are an interactive medium, then surely choosing what is and isn't interactive is in itself a design choice, right? Cutscenes can be used as a safe zone for the player, something that sets them back to a neutral state after a particularly intense encounter to communicate a transition to a new part of the game, or they can be a reward for clearing a section. If your cutscenes are good and people are invested in the story, they might look forward to taking a break for a couple of minutes after a hard grind. I have nothing against games that are dedicated to the player experience or constant engagement. A lot of my favourite games are like that. But I'm very uncomfortable with this idea that any game that doesn't 100% dedicate itself to interactivity or treat the player like the guest of honour bending over backwards to serve their every desire is somehow a failure of game design. When you start getting militant about ideas like that, you're basically saying games can't or shouldn't be used for the purposes of expression on the part of the creators, and if that's true, it kind of puts a pretty huge asterisk on that whole games are art thing, doesn't it? Those Telltale games are all about how meaningful interactivity can be when it comes in small doses, and whether you like those games or you don't, you have to admit they connect with people, and you can't seriously argue they would be an identical experience if they weren't games at all. Hideo Kojima is on record talking about how he's used cutscenes in the past to make the audience feel frustrated and anxious as events slip entirely out of their control, highlighting how powerless the character is in that situation. Just because this doesn't directly involve you pushing buttons, doesn't mean this isn't a use of interactive form to make you feel something. And speaking of Kojima, the ending of Metal Gear Solid 3 has perhaps the absolute best example of interactive storytelling I've ever seen, and without giving away any spoilers, it's one button press that takes place within a cutscene. Anything is possible if you're creative enough, and I'm not defending every use of a cutscene. Obviously, a lot of people use them terribly in really lazy ways. I'm just saying they're a valid tool on the tool belt for people to use. Okay, what about this? What you're watching now can be defined as a video essay, so it's supposed to be me talking and forming arguments supported with visual evidence, right? But what if I'm concerned that you're getting tired of hearing my voice for so long, like I am, so I cut to something random just to give you a break? Well, I can do that because it's within the possibilities of the form I'm working in. What are you gonna do about it? Call the cops on me? Form-based answer for why most people don't like cutscenes in video games. It's because most cutscenes in video games are terrible, even more so a decade ago. They're often way too long, and these characters with god-awful voices drone on and on in this punchless, clunky, expositional dialogue about stuff you can't possibly pretend to care about. Contrast that with Drake's Fortune's properly motion-captured actors, with backgrounds in TV and stage, giving real performances and interacting with each other like humans. All the cutscenes are kept short, usually no more than 1 or 2 minutes, everyone tells you something about what you're doing and where you're going, and other than one scene where Nate hangs from the treasure, which could have been a cool set piece, none of them feel like they should have been playable. I'm not going to make a fool of myself by even bothering to compare Drake's Fortune to real big-budget adventure movies. All of this praise comes with the usual caveat of good for a video game. But don't forget, we're talking about something that came out in 2007 here. It was refreshing to see little gags like this in a game.
Nate? Be careful.
Come on. I always am. Ah! I did not see that! Heads up.
Okay, it's not hilarious. I wouldn't buy a t-shirt with that line on it, but it's still cute. In a lot of other games, you'd have dialogue like, "Hey, there's skulls here. Aren't these usually found inside human heads? Do you think some people might have died here? Hey, I need to move this so we can climb over. Catch this skull." Alright, good catch. When you view Drake's Fortune in the context of the kind of stuff people would have been playing at the time, it makes more sense that so many were able to get into these characters. Remember, the other big PlayStation exclusive title that came out in 2007 was God of War 2. Whether you want to credit the script, or the actors, or the motion capture, or the animation, there's a little denying that Naughty Dog did a wonderful job of bringing these characters to life. There's one tiny problem with that though. They brought these characters to life. Alright, we've already covered how Drake's Fortune's favourite verb is to kill, and how that hurts it tonally and thematically, but we're on the home stretch of this video now, so I just want to blow off some steam by talking about how much I hate these people.
I hate your guts.
You probably think I'm going to focus on young Nate here, and while he is a selfish, thieving, hypocritical, murdering psychopath who lacks any sense of identity, seriously, what does he do in between adventures? Where does he live? What exactly does he do with all this treasure he finds? Does he just go into long phases of depression and drug use like Sherlock Holmes when he doesn't have an excuse to shoot 1,000 people in the face? Still, despite that, I think I'm going to get more mileage if I focus on his lady friend Elena Fisher. I hate this character more than I hate Kylo Ren parody accounts. I've seen her dismissed as boring by a lot of people before, and I certainly couldn't blame you if she didn't leave any kind of impression whatsoever, but it's worse than that. So, she's a journalist who's in some kind of arrangement with Nate where she provides a boat so he can find Sir Francis's diary and she gets to follow him around as he finds the treasure so she can get a big story out of it. As far as we're told, she's an ordinary person. Maybe she likes to travel around, so she's up for the whole exploring thing, but not so much on the whole firefights and murder part. So the game begins with pirates attacking their boat, and Elena quickly adjusts to having to shoot people in the face.
Do you know how to use one of these?
Yeah, it's like a camera. You point and shoot, right?
Good girl.
Okay, in this scene, she doesn't know what's happening. She's not familiar with Nate's shady past, she wasn't expecting this to happen, and they were surrounded by a lot of pirates. So this can be overlooked as kill or be killed. She was just reacting to the moment as it came. But immediately after this, it's kind of implied in a creepy way that the thing about her that begins Nate's attraction to her is how quickly she adjusted to shooting people in the face.
Sully, the girl can hold her own. You should have seen her.
After that, the boys leave her at the dock, and she tracks them down via teleportation. This is where she learns the full situation, and that there's a lot of bad people on this island. This is also where any human being with a seed of rational thought in their head would just give up and go home. But we're told over and over that she just wants that big story so much that she won't leave. Yeah, this is a pretty sick person, you know. At least Nate has sort of a personal reason to be there, and even though he doesn't get that emotional about it, he kind of has a motivation to fight the bad guys, but she's only staying on this island, capping people in the head for the sake of her journalism. Again, her career is journalism. Even the paparazzi have a stronger moral code than this. In perhaps the most baffling cutscene in the entire game, there's a part where all of this hassle gets too much even for murdery McShooterpants here, and he starts looking for a way to get off the island, and Elena bullies him into keeping on going.
Our ticket out of here. Are you giving up?
Maybe you hadn't noticed, but we're kind of outnumbered.
We're doing fine so far.
What are you talking about, we're doing fine so far? At this point in the game, as far as you know, one of you is already dead. I know this is some half-hearted attempt to make her into a strong character, but it doesn't make any sense. The problem with this character is there's no reason for her to be here, and Drake's Fortune is painfully aware of this, but refuses to admit it. It's like the train of thought was, okay, this is a bit of a brodio, we need at least one woman in this, but we can't make her the hero because people will think we're ripping off Tomb Raider. Besides, we want this hunk of man on the cover anyway. But we can't just make her a love interest, so we'll make her a journalist. That way we can justify her sodding off on her own to film stuff when we want to do big action segments without partner AI, and those climby bits without a ball and chain attached. Seriously, the game keeps doing this. It'll contrive some reason for Elena to run off every so often, and Nate will be like, okay, we've got to jump over these holes to get through these ruins, and she'll respond, I'd love to, but I've got to shoot some more footage. I need to get more pictures of pirate corpses to unlock the dodge roll. Fantastic!
That's disgusting. Oh, I wish I had my camera.
Then she disappears for a bit and shows up again whenever she feels like it.
Hey,
How did you get here?
you really need to see this.
No! Seriously, how did you get here? I went right through the house and had to shoot like 30 people. How could you have possibly got here the same time as me without anyone noticing? I guess Naughty Dog were concerned about her being a damsel in distress, so they bent over backwards to make sure she had her own motivation and agency in the story. So as long as she has this camera, she's not just, oh no! That's a shame, Elena. That really is a darn shame. By the way, unrelated question, what's your dress size? This all stems from a larger quirk in the script that becomes its biggest problem. These people are not written as characters, they are written as outlines of the roles they embody. So Nathan Drake is the hero, and we're supposed to just accept that, ignoring that good action movies generally do something to establish why we like or support the hero. Drake's fortune opts to make Nathan Drake shady and questionable from the beginning, which makes no sense in a story where we're unambiguously supposed to be on his side. Elena is the woman, because there has to be at least one. Sully is the old experienced guy who gives support. Eddie is the rival, this guy is the villain, this guy is the top henchman, and even though we know next to nothing about those last two, it's supposed to be a twist when the henchman turns out to be the real bad guy, because it's a subversion of their assumed roles in the story. Here's some more specific examples of how the writing is reliant on character roles and tropes, and is often really silly because of it. Like this scene where Nate is captured by Eddie and they're chatting. Before this, Elena shows up at the cell, again it doesn't really make sense, she teleported, and tells Nate she'll be back in a minute and she knows how to break the wall down. Later when Eddie's talking about the girl, Nate tries to cover for her by saying this.
The girl? Oh, Eddie, the girl's long gone. She's probably off the island by now. Going for help.
Daikujin, you were never very good at poker.
I get it. This scene is supposed to show affection, and that Nate is capable of caring about other people, so he tries to throw the bad guys off her scent. But it makes no sense in context, because he knows she's seconds away from busting him out, so obviously the bad guys are all going to be aware she's still on the island anyway, so it's a completely empty gesture. If anything, shouldn't he be trying to end this conversation as soon as possible, so the pirate boss guy isn't standing right there when the rescue starts? Okay, maybe that example is a little too nitpicky for your taste, so try this scene on for size. Sully gets shot near the start of the game, he survives and convinces the bad guys that he can help them look for El Dorado, but since he's the crafty old geezer who offers support, he's been buying time by deliberately sending them off on red herrings, so while the bad guys are off on one of those looking for the treasure, this conversation happens.
The vault's here. I'm sure of it. If Sullivan can be trusted...
Which he can't.
Look, he knows we'll kill him if he's lying.
Don't be stupid, he knows we'll kill him once we find the treasure. He has no incentive to tell the truth.
So, you shot the guy, and he survived, and instead of immediately capping him in the head the second he started moving, you brought him back to base so he can help you look for the treasure. But you just admitted he has no incentive to tell the truth, and you know that he knows that you're going to kill him either way, yet you're out here wasting your time going where he tells you anyway. Clearly this is supposed to show some kind of battle of wits between heroes and villains, and we're supposed to take this guy as a serious threat because he's too smart for these cheeky little tricks. But again, it doesn't make any sense at all. Then to further drive home the pointlessness of this exchange, and because we need a climax, Sully's red herring leads them directly to the treasure anyway.
Hey, Sully.
I'm here.
Remember Roman and Navarro? That red herring you sent them on to get them out of the way?
Yeah?
Well, they're sitting right on top of the treasure vault.
Oh, all the goddamn luck.
Even the climax is all kinds of messed up. Nate and Sully are captured and watch on in horror as British man opens up the treasure of El Dorado. Notice how Nate knows the treasure is dangerous and what it's capable of, but knows nothing about the details of how it actually works. Yet he says nothing this entire time. We don't even get something generic like, no, stop, you don't know what you're doing. He just stands there, but when all he knows, the fart gas inside could have burst out and affected everyone in the room. Henchman number 1 reveals himself as the true big baddie, and thank God. It was looking like we might have to shoot a white person for a moment there. Then he gives this awkward speech.
You are so pathetic. All of you, scrambling around for your petty treasures. Do you have any idea what this is worth? To the right buyer?
Yes! You ignorant people and your silly treasures. Petty-minded simpletons looking for treasures to sell for money. Not like my much more sophisticated plan to sell this treasure for money. Come on, man. It's already been established that the pretty casing is going to be worth an absurd amount of money. You don't have to sell the fart gas inside to terrorists. Come on, you're better than that. How exactly is this worth so much anyway? Why would anyone want to use this as a weapon as opposed to poison gas? Or, you know, a big bomb? Is there really someone who wants to take over the world by turning people into giant shirtless monsters that can be easily killed with guns? The Umbrella Corporation would laugh that plan off. Well, either way, the game changes villains on you minutes before the end, and then pulls out the saving the world card to try and make you care about it. Also, Elena has been captured because Destiny finally caught up to her. Then you have possibly one of the worst final boss battles in gaming history. Seriously, it seems designed from the ground up to bring out the worst in cover-based shooting mechanics and QuickTime events. It's a real low point of the game. Nathan Drake finally musters up the courage to murder someone himself within a cutscene, without me having to do it for him all the time. And look, while I was busy beating the game, Sully found some more people to murder, so there's still some monetary gain in this, because saving the world wasn't a big enough prize. Our heroes, everyone! Well, I hope this has been interesting. We've looked at the game from the angles of cultural context, graphics, characters, writing, story, production values, shooting, platforming, cutscenes, themes, racism... Wait, oh no, I forgot about replay value! If you ever feel like playing it again, there's some collectible treasures to find. Alright, that'll do. Now, after all of that, the question is, how does Uncharted Drake's Fortune hold up today? Did the naughty gods stick the landing on crafting a classic adventure, or are the unimpressed detractors correct, and it's just overrated schlock? Well, it's alright. Alright, this video was months of work for me. I'm as disappointed as you. I do think Drake's Fortune hugely benefited from the context it was released in. It was definitely the kind of game people were looking for at the time. Outside of saving PlayStation 3s from starvation, people were excited about all the possibilities of the new hardware and how much bigger games could get. And in many ways, Drake's Fortune felt like an exciting teaser of everything that was to come, as well as being a pretty fun time in itself. Having said that, I still feel uneasy from any suggestion that the game has aged badly, because returning to it for the purposes of this video for the first time in years, it really hasn't. Especially not with this remastered version shining it up and removing some of the old quirks like awkward 6-axis controls. Honestly, anything about it that was ever fun is pretty much still fun today. Naughty Dog did fantastic work on this game, and obviously individual aspects of it are dated now, but the overall quality of the craftsmanship and how this game was put together still holds up. It's a popcorn game, it's beautiful looking, it's fun enough, and although it has a lot of problems, especially with its script, there's not really any major deal breakers. It moves along at a brisk enough pace where it's easy to ignore the issues if you're willing to go along with it. And again, that doesn't make the game great, but it makes it easy to digest, a decent distraction that you can run through a couple of times. It makes it fine. If that's the case, why all the mass critical acclaim, and why all the backlash in recent years? Well look, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. I don't have a lot of faith in game reviews, and so I don't lose any friends here, I'm going to mostly address the initial reviews from 2007. This has definitely gotten better over the last decade, but I feel due to video games' background in tech and consumer culture, combined with the time pressures reviewers face, a lot of mainstream game reviews tend to praise games for basic competence. So games often get more praise for ticking boxes and not getting anything wrong than they are for trying something new, experimental, or non-conventional. If you've ever heard somebody say something like, "Personally, I don't like 9 out of 10 games, I much prefer the 7 out of 10 games," this is basically what they mean. By being technically impressive, having a lot of different mechanics, and containing a story, while having no major obvious issues to point out that could ruin the whole experience, Drake's Fortune is a 9 out of 10 game through and through. The problem is now people go into it expecting it to blow their minds, which is a lot to expect from a simple popcorn game. It probably doesn't help that the first couple of chapters of the game are a little slower than the rest of it. The part in the opening where you're going through the jungle to find a temple to explore with no shooting, that might have set some people up to think that exploring would play a much bigger role in the game than it actually does. And again, when your game looks like this, not being able to explore as much as the game initially leads you to believe is a real letdown. Honestly, if you haven't played this game and you think you might like this sort of thing, I still recommend it. Naughty Dog are taking a hardline stance that Uncharted 4 is going to be the last one of these they make, so who knows, maybe when this series' presence in the mainstream starts to fade away and people stop shrieking about them so we can forget about the whole "it's just as good as Indiana Jones" nonsense, maybe people will be able to appreciate this game for the silly little distraction that it is. But that's this game. What can be said for its sequels? Well, that's a story for another time. thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, maybe you could send it to someone else who might also enjoy it. And if you hated it, maybe send it to them anyway, and you can hate it with them. Because that's what my videos are really about, bringing people together. You can follow me on Twitter at LesmoCon. That's kind of the best way to interact with me, and also see what I'm working on next. I would like to thank James Berridge for making a logo that looked all nice and better than I could do it. And also especially thank Lewis Fry and James Brallant, who gave me money to keep me alive so I could actually finish this. And incidentally, if you would also like to send me money to keep me alive to work on other stuff, you can do that at my Patreon. And there's no tiers or anything. You can just throw me anything, and it's really appreciated, because I sure am hungry. Okay, I'm gonna go sit down now. So bye, and thanks again.